This place, there's a very special air to it. Amazing the little things you notice when you take the time to stop and listen. And that's why we're here, isn't it? Welcome to Saint Idilora's convent for recollection and reformation. Our founder, Saint Idilora, built this convent to train young girls such as yourselves to become proper children of God. Children worthy of becoming saints.
Hey, I just wanted to say that I'm very excited to spend the week with you guys. I'm sure this will be an enlightening experience for all of us.
Look, let's just cut to the chase. What are you here for exactly? This isn't exactly a prime summer destination. You don't really go here unless, you're forced to.
That's the issue, isn't it, Gabriella? Distractions. So many distractions we're letting into our lives, and even in these trying times, we still take for granted God's loving grace. You two, however, are very fortunate that your parents were responsible enough to take an active role in your formation. You should get some rest. We shall start first thing tomorrow.
Hello and welcome to the live stream wrap party of Saint Maker. Now, I'm not expecting very many people, if anybody, to be here for the live, just because, like most of my Friday series, it's a smaller one. Smaller developer, yangyang Mobile, still pretty small, though doing great work. Been able to produce a few titles since I even came to know their first title. So it was really a pleasure to be able to cover this title, to cover this game, which was actually selected by the patrons by vote. And because of similar vote, I will also be announcing at the end of this video what we'll be covering next time. Again, a smaller, most likely title. I try and stick those. I haven't been successful because I keep myself from spoilers, but I try to keep them to be studios that are either smaller or at least titles that just aren't catching very much attention, but might be hidden gems. And this is definitely a hidden gem. But some visual novels, visual novels usually come in two distinct flavors, you could say. Either it's all about a journey that the player gets to kind of dictate, very much narrative-based, branching storylines, choose-your-own-adventure type of games, which are fantastic. It's actually the aspect of visual novels that really pulled me in from the get-go. But there's another side to visual novels. It's kind of like the competing polarization points of a visual novel and what makes it unique in the game space. Because, they're not, I've heard people say that they're not games, and I kind of agree. And that other branch is to tell a story. Is to tell something that's moving and impactful, and something that's kind of challenges maybe what you could be thinking originally, or what you would contemplate. And that's kind of what this story specifically heralds on. I played through and made some of the different choices that come up in the game, and I'll be frank, there are not really any impactful changes that occur. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit. I'm going to break it down, kind of talk about my thoughts. This is going to be a shorter video just because since it doesn't have a branching narrative to explore and a very limited number of characters, there's only so much I can say, but the themes and nature of this tale really touched on stuff that has had a big impact on my life, which I mentioned throughout the video. So I'm probably going to repeat some core concepts again, but with the concept of the whole picture. And like I said, that probably means this is going to be a shorter wrap party, but for any of you who are stumbling upon this, just know that this is kind of like my crowning thoughts. And if you haven't had a chance to play this game yet, and it sounds at all like something you'd want to play, please make sure you do that, because this is going to be spoilers. And really, there isn't a whole lot to this game besides spoilers because of the nature of a non-real branching, a very linear path. But that doesn't detract from the experience that this game can bring. There's something really moving about it, and there's a passion that's here that is not very common in visual novels, because it's different. It's a different kind of passion. Some stories are told because they just are bursting out. Their characters, their worlds, their magic that just can't be contained anymore, and you want to share it. You want to make it so others can experience the joy and fear and pain and happiness that come with your story, whether it's something that you originated purely on yourself or a conglomeration of concepts that you just really wanted to share out there. And then there are stories that need to be said because they touch on subjects that are difficult. That's actually what's interesting about the whole concept, especially like lately in the United States, is becoming more and more prevalent. I think everyone experiences this no matter where you are in the world. But there's been an uptick in book bannings. And it's a battle that we have because people get worried about content that challenges ideas, challenges traditions, ideas that challenge ways of thought, or even like what is generally guessed as being accepted as right and wrong. And those stories that are getting banned walk that line. Either they're trying to do something too far, taking things too far and making it uncomfortable, or potentially like easy to misinterpret, and that can be an issue. Or they're touching on topics and tackling them in a way that challenges what many people would consider to be right, proper, or even traditional. And that's really what the core of this story was. And I believe that the writer was, I believe, expressing what they likely had experienced themselves. I'm not saying that they experienced the trauma that is depicted with Holly's story or Adira's story. But I believe that they are boiled down in pure expressions of what it's like growing up in a very oppressively religious home. I said this a lot before. I grew up in a home that was religious, and I grew in a community that was very religious. I was lucky that it was never really oppressive like it can be. I did see those who experienced a very oppressive home religion and tutelage. So I can definitely relate on a very personal level to this, but it also highlights some of the things that are the most worrisome about a traditional religion. And the thing is, like, this is taken through the eyes of someone who has experienced Christianity, which at least in like my home country, obviously is the prominent religion. But you have to remember that these are traits that I think we can see in history throughout all religious observances, and I'd even argue secular observances that are team-based or us versus them-based. It can be a political parties, it can be a sports team that you cheer for. Any and all of these entities where you have a community of people who supposedly agree or are supposed to agree on a set of values, experiences, expressions, and points of view, and how that can turn toxic, how that can turn aggressively oppressive, and it can twist the good and the emotions that were once like like the thing, like religions and these observances, teams and clubs and groups don't originate out of a sense of malice typically. If they do, they typically are organized in a very different way, and they don't presume themselves to be a source of good and proper living. But religion, especially, is supposed to be a paragon, a beacon, a rallying point for people, for their hopes, their fears, and to strive to become something greater, which is interesting. It's a very new phenomena in the history of humanity. Religion used to just be a way to try and help explain what we couldn't explain. Now it tries to give purpose. But that purpose can be twisted. The twisting comes from the improper application of faith, love, and hope. And when they're twisted, like anything can be twisted, it can become a weapon of pain and suffering, despite the motivation coming from such a good, proper, and wholesome source. That's what's really heartbreaking, is that the story we see here, which, while it is Holly's story, I think it's more Adira's story. The story revolves mostly around the consequences of the life Adira has witnessed and has become. So, I guess with Camilla, which is the scene depicted here, ironically, well, not ironically, but properly here. For Adira, that was the beginning, because she was somebody who was like naturally caring. She wanted to be able to help people. She wanted to find a place, and it even sounded like Adira came from a rough childhood, whether it be an orphan, or coming from a home that was very like abusive, or potentially just somebody who made mistakes and decided to turn their back and try and make something better of themselves. You can take that emotion, you take that desire, but then she got forced to be put in situations where she suffered from physical and mental abuse. She suffered manipulation, and by people who were seen as being more wholly superior to her. And yet, she even says in her own recollection that she can't leave, she can't change, because she has nowhere else to go. And that's kind of the scary thing, is that whether intentional or not, a lot of times religion can make you feel trapped. Because you get told over and over again that if you disagree, bad things happen. You go to hell, you'll be separated from your family and your loved ones. Sometimes that can happen and be encouraged, like being ostracized and ignored, and that can have a terrible effect, especially on the young. But you could be in your 80s, and that can have such a terrible, terrible effect on your life and your perspective. Because for many of us, out of the cloying fear of death, we try and cling to hope, and the source of that hope can also be if it's turned against us, it takes that hope and replaces it with fear, and then returns the dread that hope once tried to heal, that tried to cover and tried to give us like a sense of purpose for. And that turnabout can make things difficult. It can make people bitter. I know that people sometimes who turn away from religion become jaded against it. And I don't think it's because the religion is itself evil. It's that people used that as an excuse to do evil things, and were so persuaded in what they were doing that they turned aside from clearly destructive attitudes, or blind eye to clearly abusive situations, and tried to cover them up out of a sense of loyalty, out of a sense of propriety, or perception. The fear that one bad apple makes the whole bunch smell. That if you let somebody make these terrible choices and then be called out for it, that it will reflect on all the good that's being done. And what's one small evil in the face of all that good? And that's where the slope gets slippery. And that's how the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't think the sisters that are depicted here, the sisters who picked on Adira, or Saint Idolora, who was fictitious, obviously, not especially after I made sure. I had to look it up just to be careful. But these sisters were never motivated by desires to be cruel. The sisters that picked on Adira likely suffered the same treatment when they were young and were simply exercising their right and the ability and working their frustrations out the only way they'd been taught how to. So you can't even look at them as twisted as they were and just say that they were an evil presence, an evil representation. They were a manifestation of the very same problems that they perpetuated. And that's what's so scary about all of this, is how real, raw, and just genuine all of this can end up being. And how we don't really know what's going on in the lives of those around us. And so that's why it's so difficult even to talk about these ideas, and why I've taken so long and being so rambly. It's just these are things I've seen, I've witnessed, I've experienced this. Thankfully, I've been able to experience it in a way that was isolated, where I had support and I was able to recognize it for what it was. But most of us, I don't think, get that opportunity until we're so old that we've already gone through the worst of it. And that's terrible. So let's get to the story, the crux of the story. I already mentioned Adira a bit, but I want to focus on Holly, whose character we see through the eyes of. And the first thing that I think was really important that we got to see was her ability to self-delusion. And it's interesting because in Holly I see a lot of myself, because she does have a practice of being able to try and stay out of situations that are confrontational, that are aggressive or abusive or painful, by ducking her head and saying what she knows others want to hear. It's a survival tactic, a tactic that many of us experience. And the funny thing is that I've definitely experienced, and I'm really pretty good at thinking my way through conversations like that, but I didn't have to go through extreme abuse. At least I don't think so. I really don't think I experienced much abuse at all. Mine came out of a fear of being judged, of being hated. I was so preoccupied with the way people perceived me that I backed myself into corners and learned how to speak in ways that people could just agree with and never have a dissenting attitude or opinion. I would bend over backward and make life easier for those around me in order to make sure that I'd never be disliked. And that's a painful way to live. Holly is doing it out of not only that desire to avoid confrontation, but also out of direct fear. But that meant that she had to bottle up her own pain and her horror of the horrible memory of what happened to her sister. A sister she loved, but who was frustrated with, because Holly did so much to try and just avoid confrontation until she could find her own space and get out. She knew that someday she just was going to go and just set her own path, and then she could worry about stuff. But Liana was not good at that social dodging. And so she took a lot of the brunting of the abuse, but Holly was kind of by proxy involved. And that's what was so hard for her and why she had such a stance. And what's so heartbreaking about those last words, you never think, oh, this might be the last time I talk to my beloved sister or partner or child. And we often, even to those who we love the most and care the most about, we often can be the harshest on them. We can throw out words carelessly, out of frustration, out of desperation, out of fear. We can say really hurtful things. And that horror of realizing that you, in your last moments with somebody, unwittingly caused more harm than good. And then to have that lingering fear that she somehow heard Liana's fall and heard her asking for help and didn't act on it because she was so she was tired. She assumed it was just a dream. But then realizing that what had happened, and also knowing that Liana fell from the roof because of the box that she had put her up there. That was something I kind of called a little early, but it wasn't really touched on as much as I thought it was. Her horror was mostly at the hearing the accident and letting her sister die alone, which is terrible. But also just knowing that the box was what lured her there. And that's just a burden I don't think anyone can healthily hold on to without help. And so to have to live a life where that was bottled up, and in a home in a faith where suicide is seen as murder, and thus her mom, being devoutly religious, who likely was very torn apart by the death of her daughter, attempted to shut the memory away out of shame, fear, and sorrow, because that's what people do, even when we're supposed to like process it, even when we're supposed to talk about it. And that's what's really terrifying about this story, is that it's all about trauma, and it's about how not processing that trauma doesn't help. It tends to just let it fester and grow. It twisted Holly into something she didn't even recognize. So much so that her mom sent her there because she was behaving so differently. And while it was a very excruciating experience, and terrifying, while this convent was a place of I would describe it as evil. I do still think too, by the way, I don't think they were ghosts. I think the what we were seeing were manifest memories. That the convent itself was kind of metaphysically trapping memories and echoes of people, and that corruption kind of just sank into the very core of everything there and reflected the darkness inside everyone around. And that's what the horror elements were all about. Really, there was never a question of whether these things really were happening or not. Obviously, they kind of were, because there was information that was gleaned that could not have been learned otherwise. But at the same time, that was never the point, right? They didn't perform an exorcism. They didn't confront a demon. They didn't even, directly confront, the manifestations they saw. They ultimately confronted other people. Because as much of the horror of this game was, it was symbolic of the horror that was inside of the hearts of everyone involved. In fact, the only person who wasn't really that involved was Gabby, who was kind of just there, who got caught up in everything. But that was because, despite her troubling situation, she'd had a healthy enough relationship with her family, a healthy enough relationship with herself and her friends, that even though things had not gone well, she was a great example of someone who was able to internalize, deconstruct, and move forward through trauma. It's so interesting that at the beginning, she was kind of displayed as the rowdy, unhealthy one. She was displayed as the most troubled person. But she all along was the healthiest individual, mentally, emotionally, in the entire story. She knew who she was, and she understood that things weren't okay. She lashed out, as kids do, but what choice did she have? She couldn't really set her own path yet. She wasn't old enough. And to see that manifestation and have her kind of be there as an older sister, friend, or potentially more for Holly, kind of gave Holly the opportunity to kind of have that flipped on her head, where she was the helpless one now. She was the one who was crying for help, and who had somebody there to listen. The person that she was always for Liana, and whom she had started to almost hate. That person, that part of herself where she had failed. Felt that she'd failed at something that was so precious and powerful. And then Adira, I already touched on her, but I kind of want to point out again that Adira only wanted to do good, even to the end. She'd grown to love and respect the sisters of the convent and Sister Adalora because they did do so much good. It's just that she became obsessed with their memory, obsessed with their work, and sadly obsessed with their cover-ups. Because in the face of so much good, what's some losses? Some flaws. Just because a few children don't survive the very harrowing project that has been successful for so many others, does that undo all the good they did? And that's an argument that's horrifying to have, but we have it all the time. How often are we willing to overlook the actions of movie stars and singers, politicians whom we like, admire, respect, or who we believe represent us somehow? How often are they given breaks that others can't have? How often are our views on the actions of others skewed more by who they are than by what they did. And that's the real trouble here. That's the trouble that Adira had to overcome and had to help. And we don't even know if she overcame. She had to give the opportunity to overcome. Understanding that there was an evil rot at the core of what the place was. The convent was twisted around the lies, manipulation, and the darkness. Because, like, while there's an argument to be made that, like, there's so much good that is done. Like, what if, is it okay if some bad things happen? We flip that on its head, and you say, at what point does a little bit of some bad, at what point does one bruise spread to the whole fruit and lead to rot? At what point does an injury stop being internal and start becoming a medical crisis? We can't tolerate rot. We can't tolerate mistakes because we can't excuse it. We have to hold each one up and examine it on its own individually, and we need to stop glorifying or dehumanizing people, whether the victims, whom we often get caught up in a lie that they are just seeking attention, or in sympathy for somebody whom we've had a lot of positive feeling for. One of the greatest examples I have is a man named Ryan Haywood. He was a now notorious worker at a company, Rooster Teeth, specifically with Achievement Hunter. I grew up watching Achievement Hunter videos. That was like my bread and butter. That was my, like, I grew up like as a kid watching like rerun cartoons, and then I shifted to YouTube when when I was a teenager, and that was like my entertainment. I still watch a lot of YouTube. Like, I don't just make content for YouTube. I was inspired to do so, but I also watch a lot. And this Ryan was one of the best examples, in my opinion. He was just entertaining, engaging. He was a devoted, like, he portrayed himself as a devoted family man. He also kind of showed that, like, you didn't have to be young to capture an audience of, like, both old and young. That you can still be entertaining and engaging and be yourself, to be different, because he wasn't the same as other people. He didn't project the same image or the same kind of humor. He took things on his own, and he really was an inspiration for me. In fact, it was one of the inspirations that led me to make this channel, because it's easy to believe, like, oh, you know, like, starting YouTube is for stuff you do when you're, like, 16 and then become big and famous, right? But no, it's like, you don't have to make content because you want to get famous, and you don't have to do it just because you're not super young. You can just make content because you want to make content, and he was a big inspiration for that. And over the pandemic, it came out that he had been not only running around on his family and, like, participating in and having multiple, like, secret, like, partners, which is, bad enough. Like, it's one thing if it's, like, obviously, like, if you're consensually having like a plural relationship, like, I mean, that's between, like, the family and the people involved, right? But when it's secret, when it's behind the back of somebody whom he claims to love and cherish, and when some of the people who did so have stepped forward and presented evidence showing that these events might have occurred when they were underage, it really changed everything. And it took a person whom I had become personally invested in and flipped it on its head. And it is very hard to accept that at first. It took soul searching, and that was for somebody whom I just respected as a content creator. It wasn't somebody whom I looked up to as a teacher, a mentor, an example. And so when it's those types of people, when it's those individuals whom not only you but your family and friends respect and care for, those whom think the best of them, and when you ever try and cast doubt or try and call out something that was a little too weird, and you get backlash as if you're trying to make up a lie to get attention, that's horrifying. And it can become an issue where you start to believe the lies, because, you know what, I'm not as good a person as they are, so if they say I'm not that I'm wrong, I must be wrong. And that's terrible. It's terrifying, and it's a weapon that's used by those who take good organizations and twist them to their own ends, whether because of power, money, or even just some kind of twisted desire that they have. Saint Idolora is somebody I'm not too sure about. Like, she certainly seemed motivated to try and do good, but why was she so willing to destroy so much in that path? I don't know. Anyway, I think that's pretty much all the characters. I think we've talked about everything that really mattered here. And I think that the last thing I'd want to say before I leave is all of us, every single one of us, have had to experience something in the past that leaves its demons and its marks. Sometimes we figure things out. We either, we get help, we talk things through, we move on, we make a choice to leave it behind, whatever it is. It's one of the benefits of growing up, is you often can leave that stuff behind. That doesn't mean you should just set it aside. You should still seek help, closure, by talking about it and seeking professionals. It used to be stigmatized that seeking a professional therapist was like, oh, it's what you do when things are really bad. You don't. Honestly, I found when I was going through some very traumatic life upheavals where I lost some very close family members very close together in time, just having a few sessions where I could just talk about stuff in ways that I hadn't really thought about or allowed myself to think about alone put me on the right path. And so it's really important to seek help, talk about things, and to know that oftentimes, even if you feel like you're the one who's at fault and making the worst mistakes, you're not just completely forsaken. It's not entirely your fault. It never is. There's always more to the story than you'd think. And it's important to recognize that it's okay to not feel okay. When you live in a world, especially if it's dominated by religion, there's a pursuit of perfection that I think sometimes gets in the way of that. The idea that if you admit weakness, if you show that you aren't okay, or that you have doubts, or that you are confused, that it means you're not faithful, that it means that you are wanting to leave, that you just want an excuse to, quote, commit sins. And I don't think that's the case at all. Too many times, out of the desire of keeping families together and keeping people safe within the bounds of and restrictions of a religion, people are traumatically trapped and caged, not allowed to contemplate, ask questions, or pursue their own interests. And I think that that's interesting. And that's really what the ending of the game was really cool for. There was one section in this game where the choice really mattered, and it was the last choice. It's when Holly walks away with Gabby. Gabby asks, what do you want to do? And you can choose a couple different options. Whether Holly goes home and tries to repair her relationships, whether she stays away, feeling like it's too traumatic a place to return to. And if she does step away, does she take Gabby's offer to go and spend time with her? Or does she just decide to stick it out on her own and not be reliant on other people? And I don't think there's supposed to be a right choice there. I think all those are valid choices. And I think that it's part of life's journey, not that we make the right choice, but that we learn and grow from whatever the choice is that we make. And that we should never give up on anybody, no matter how far gone they seem, no matter how deluded they might appear. Even Gabby and Holly never gave up on Adira, despite how crazy she started acting at some points. Despite, Adira, accidentally or literally attacking them. They still held on hope. They saw her as a human. And that's something that we all need to remember. And I think you need to remember that too. That you're just as valuable as anybody else. And that the people around you are valuable too. So, anyway. I do think this is where we're going to wrap things up, because that's the most important lessons I learned from this game. And I'm really happy I played it. It was definitely shorter, and it was very railroady, but it talks about stuff that I think somebody needed to get off their chest, something that I think we could benefit from hearing. I certainly did, and I'm grateful for it. So now, it's time to start the wind down, and the beginning and preparation for what is to come. I think it's time for us to reflect on the fact that We have more great stories to cover. And I left in the hands of the patrons the choice, again, of what we are going to cover on my Friday slots. I'm thinking of potentially reaching out to you guys, patrons, and trying to reorganize things, and maybe having you pick what we do on Wednesdays instead of Fridays. Because I love highlighting smaller games, but I think I want to start getting you guys more excited about the picks we make, and I don't want to shackle you anymore. So I'm thinking that's a major change I'm going to do after this next title. I think I'm going to shift it and have the patrons vote. Well, maybe we'll open it up, and Wednesdays will be the smaller series, and Fridays will still be Fan Fridays, but they'll be picked by you patrons, and I'm going to leave the door open for anything that hasn't already been approved. So if it's not already on the schedule, you all can just pick from it. I'll take suggestions from the patrons every time we're about to have another like selection, and then I'll narrow down the choices to like top 3, and then we'll have a runoff run with the patrons. So because I've always wanted the patrons to feel engaged, and I feel like I haven't been able to. That while these smaller projects have been great, I think it's time I switch it up a bit. So anyway, this is the last small title that's been voted on by the patrons that's going to be purely picked by the patrons rather than picked purely by me. So we're going to quickly step away from this, and I'm going to play a quick trailer of what we are doing now. Oh. All right. This is what we'll be starting with, starting next Friday. What could possibly be wrong with a bunch of innocent vegetables in a cabin that's really dark? Anyway, I don't know anything about that game other than the fact that Matt Pat made a video or two about it, and as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh no. It was being recommended to me already at the time, and I was like, oh dear. So I'm excited to get that started. Anyway, thank you so much for any of you who have been watching here or who are watching in the future. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you spending your time with me and being able to share this journey and many more like it. Hope you're having a great rest of your day. And until next video watching me, ever see me next. I'll see you there. Have a good night, everybody.